This is the Author Blurb podcast, where readers and authors connect. We are here for you to learn and discover those authors who are not either large names or as popular as some might find, but they're entertaining, they're fun, and they're enjoyable to listen to in these interviews. So take the time, learn more about them, enjoy the interviews, and remember to go to authorblurb.com where you can find out more about them, about the shows, and other guests that we have. So I am here on Author Blurb talking to Steve Eoannou, Eoannou. I'm sorry, Eoannou.
Oh, for two.
You know, it's at this point, if I don't mess somebody's name up at the beginning, I'm not doing my job, I guess.
You're not the first one.
I have a horrible habit of it, but honestly, I got your name right on the second try. That's better than some others.
Yeah.
But Steve, I appreciate you being here. I'm actually looking forward to hearing about your books. They seem really interested. I enjoy history, especially American history, which your books are a historical fiction, and they sound interesting. Steve, if you could tell me a bit about yourself, about your books, and let us know about what's going on, I would love to learn more about them.
Sure. Thanks. And first of all, thanks for having me on today. I've been writing for a long time, over 30 years, and I've only recently started writing well, I guess, because my first book, Muscle Cars, which is a short story collection, came out about 7 years now. And then last year, Rook came out, which again is a historical novel. It's based on the life of a man named Eoannou, who was a Buffalo guy, where I'm from, a small business owner, married his high school sweetheart, had their first child, and he would occasionally tell his wife he was going out of town for business. But Al's business was robbing banks, and he robbed about 6 of them before his wife or the FBI knew what he was up to. It's based on a true story.
Oh, okay.
This year, in October, my second novel, Yesteryear, is coming out. That's also based on a man named Franz Stryker, who was a Buffalo guy and a neighborhood guy. And he was the man who created the Lone Ranger. And depending how you look at it, he was either involved in the best deal in entertainment history or the worst deal in entertainment history, because he sold the rights for $10 before the Lone Ranger became, a phenomenon. So he missed out on a lot of the glory. That novel is a little bit unique compared to Muscle Cars and Rook, because it's part historical fiction, it's part biographical fiction, it's part noir, it's comic, some magical realism thrown in there. So it's kind of blending genres together. So that was a fun book to write.
All right. So let's start off with your first book. Was that Rook or Muscle Car?
Muscle Cars.
All right, so Muscle Car. And to be honest with you, Muscle Car was the first one to catch my attention just because of my personal history growing up with classic cars and muscle cars and things like that. What's the premise behind Muscle Car for people?
So Muscle Cars, it's the title story of 17 short stories that make up the collection. And I tell people it's 17 stories about men making poor decisions, semi-autobiographical. So it's Muscle Cars is the lead story. It was the first story that I really wrote that I felt that was a complete short story, and so it got the lead-off position in the title story. The stories are not all about cars, although they certainly do appear throughout the book and used in various ways. But it's mostly about growing up, life decisions, and really kind of exploring the different stages, I guess, of growing up as a man in 20th century America. Like all my work, they're based in Buffalo, New York. But even if I don't name the city, and you would just think it was just an industrialized city in the Northeast, if you're from this area, you would say, oh, Volker's Bowling Alley or Forest Lawn Cemetery. I know where he's talking about. But I decided I would say within the last 10 years that the stories that I really love are the ones that are based here in Buffalo with the history, not only family history, but history of the city. And I'm trying to carve out my turf, my literary turf, the way Richard Russo did for downstate New York, and William Kennedy did for Albany, New York, and his Albany trilogy. So the area I'm exploring, at least at this stage in my writing, is all Buffalo based.
All right. Now, with Muscle Car, you're saying that there's a bunch of stories about men making mistakes. What would you kind of classify those stories in? Because there's a lot of different types of stories. I know that some of the description read of a guy who's selling memorabilia. Are the stories taking place in present day America, or are they taking place like 10, 20, 50 years ago?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would classify them as literary fiction, and all 17 stories had been published in literary journals before they were put in this collection. So I was proud of that. And I would say a lot of them, some of them are set in the 1970s. That's when I grew up. Some of them are set post post Iran and Afghanistan, dealing with some veteran issues. And some aren't really placed in time. They're just kind of, you just know it's kind of the 20th century, but you're not really sure where it is, late 20th century. But yeah, I would say that present day, recent past, in the 70s are most of the story settings.
All right. And what kind of topics do they really cover? Because it seems like there's a boxer, I think I read, which you almost have a boxer in every story in all three books, it seems like.
Well, that's exactly right. Yeah, my family, especially my cousin Dean, he's been involved in boxing all his life. He was a boxing coach. He started the University of Buffalo's boxing program. I never boxed, although I do, train just to get some cardio in. But I always used to go to the Golden Gloves and take my son. So boxing was always part of at least my growing up and parenting, I guess. The stories, they're about boxing on the surface, or at least that story that you mentioned from Muscle Cars. But that one was really dealing about, family relations, family relations with the brother. There's a story in there that deals with, the aging and passing of someone's father. So a lot of these really deal with relationships that men have with women, with girlfriends, with family members. But on the surface, there's things like selling an autographed baseball from the 1947 New York Yankees team, or talking about how Robert Mitchum, the movie actor, spent his last day. So we're exploring things like that. We're using cars as kind of connecting things in a lot of the stories, but it's really about the relationships we have and how we struggle with them.
I understand. And I know, at least growing up in the Midwest, like I did, cars were a big part of a lot of bonding and things like this. My stepdad and I worked on a piece of junk Firebird I had, which I loved the thing to death all the way up till the day it died.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's one of those things that you don't realize what's going on. You're just working on it. You're talking. So I understand relationships and things like that do come out, and that's why I said Muscle Cars kind of attracted me, is because it brought me back to the days of growing up where I was around classic cars, going to shows, and then working on the cars, and cars always being somewhat of a part of your life in one way or another. So
yeah, same thing. Growing up here, my buddies and I, we had junkers. We had Muscle Cars wannabes. Missing floorboards, no heat in Buffalo during the winters, pushing them home. But there was cars in the neighborhood, cars in the parking lot at school that were just we all envied them, but we didn't drive them.
I know that feeling all too well. So let's go to Rook, your next book. So that one there has me interested as well, because it also has a part to play with chess, if I'm remembering correctly. So Rook, you said, is about a guy who's a bank robber, robs 6 banks before he gets found out. But in the description, it talks about him also being a chess player. How's that all tie in together? I mean, what
Yeah.
is the real story about?
Yeah, Al is a fascinating guy. He was an avid chess player, and he loved the strategy of chess. He loved coming up with a plan and executing that plan. And he viewed robbing banks as the same thing, as a game, as a strategy to try to outwit outwit the FBI, outwit the bank guards and the bank presidents, have a clean getaway. Um, and he would plan his jobs to a very meticulous T. He's even quoted as saying that playing that robbing banks is chess for cash prizes. That's the way he viewed it. And eventually he got caught, and he was sent to prison. He ended up serving about 14 years in federal prison, and he became a prison chess champion, playing correspondence games and matches. But also, and this really intrigued me and had the hook set when I was reading about Al, is while he was in prison, not only became an avid chess champion, he became a writer. So Alfred Hitchcock, Mike Shane mystery magazines, Scholastic books, if you remember those when we were
Hmm.
kids, a penny a word guy. And he, that's what he did. And when he was paroled in the mid 70s, he went out to LA and wrote for television. And he actually won an award from the Mystery Writers of America, an organization that's still around today.
Hmm.
And they asked him in the interview at the awards ceremony, Al, you had the second act to your life. That's, what do you think? And his quote was, writing's fine, but I'd rather be robbing banks. So he was kind of unrepentant to the end, but also a very smart man and a very good marketer. And he really played up the fact that, yeah, he was a crime writer and he knows crime because he lived it. He served the time, and he did not shy away from that when marketing his books.
I understand. Now, how much of your book is based off the reality of the story of what happened and fiction in a sense?
Yeah, it's the basic timeline is accurate. The plot points are accurate. I had Al's FBI file. I got under the Freedom of Information Act and his prison record. So details about the guns and when robberies took place and the getaway cars, that's all accurate. I had a pretty good view into Al's personality. Um, but I don't have access to his mind. Unfortunately, Al passed away and never had a chance to interview him. So when we talk about his personality and his interior monologue and his thoughts and all the characters' thoughts,
Hmm.
um, that's really where the fiction comes in, where I'm imagining based on what I know how he would act or say or respond. The book switches points of view, and I tell people, and this kind of goes back to muscle cars and how the book is about relationships. Rook is about a bank robber, and it's a crime story, but it's
Hmm.
also the story of the end of a marriage. Um, so the points of view in chapters alternate between Al, on the run from the FBI, and his wife Lolly, who he left behind with his small daughter, his infant daughter. So when I'm talking about Lolly and her thoughts and her dreams, she was not a public figure like Al was. So that again is all my imagining of what it would be like to be uh, a woman in the early 1960s, high school grad, an infant daughter, and you just found out your husband's on the top of the most wanted list, and your whole world just implodes. That's my imagination. Side story: that infant daughter, I got a chance to meet last summer, and we've met a few times, exchanged emails. Very busy woman, and she was flying out to L.A. Last week, and she goes, Steve. She wrote me, emailed me, said, Steve, I'm finally get a chance to sit down and read Rook. We'll talk when I get back. So I'm looking forward to see what's her take on how I portrayed her family.
Well, that'll be interesting.
It'll be an
So
interesting conversation.
I can only imagine. So what drew you into writing that story?
I think a couple things, and I remember exactly where I was. It was a Sunday morning. They did a feature on Alan, the Buffalo News, um, because his daughter uh, Allison was trying to get his short stories all kind of collected. And I'm reading the story, and the headline of that piece was, or the title of that piece was, um, "Buffalo Bank Robber Turned Author." A strange tale of a Buffalo bank robber turned author, something like that. And I said, wait, I'm really interested in this. And then you find out, what such an interesting life he had, and how he was unrepentant at the end, and how the FBI was still, looking at him when a very sophisticated bank job took place, and nobody really knows about Al. Kind of like no one really knows about Fran Stryker from Yesteryear anymore, because so much time had passed and there's been so many other criminals since then. And I thought this was really something really interesting for me to explore, and really dig into Al's story. So it was a good first novel to write. I learned a lot writing that book.
All right. Now, you have another one that's coming out Yesteryear.
Hmm.
Now, that one there, and I remember watching the reruns of The Lone Ranger, which I never understood because he was the only ranger, but he always had a sidekick. So, as a weird child that I was, I always sat there and goes, why is he called Lone when he has a friend?
Right.
But help us understand first off why you wanted to write about him. With there's 100 different people in history to write about.
Yeah.
What was it
I
about them?
And it's funny, I've said this before, with muscle cars, I could tell you where I was or where I got the idea for all 17 stories. With Rook, I'm reading the paper on a Sunday morning. Yesteryear, I don't know. I think I was at a party or a bar, and somebody mentioned in passing, hey, the guy who wrote The Lone Ranger's from Buffalo. And I said, no, he's not. I mean, I would have heard of him. I'm a Buffalo-based writer, and Buffalo is a town that's really good for promoting people from here or associated with here who've gone on to have success, whether it's in music with the Goo Goo Dolls, or Joyce Carol Oates, who was born here, or Mark Twain, who was the editor of the newspaper here. They're very good about promoting us creatives from this area or associated. And I had never heard of Franz Stryker. And I said, no, he's not from here. And of course, I Google it, and it turns out not only was he from Buffalo, he was from the neighborhood I was living in at the time called the Elmwood Village. And he went to high school 2 blocks up the street or 3 blocks up the street at Lafayette High School. I said, well, how can I not know about this man? And I go on to read that not only wrote The Lone Ranger, he wrote The Green Hornet, Sergeant
Hmm.
Preston of the Yukon, the Tom Quest action series for teenage boys. How can I not know about this man? More research, and that's when I found out that he had sold the rights to a man named George W. Trendle, who owned radio station WXYZ in Detroit, right before the Lone Ranger just exploded and become this pop culture icon. And he sold it for $10, the rights away. And I know. And so that got me because, again, it's a Buffalo story, coming this close to winning the Super Bowl, coming this close to winning the Stanley Cup. It's a Buffalo story, I felt in my gut. And the reason he sold it, he was not a dumb man by any stretch of the imagination. He was already selling individual Lone Ranger scripts to Trendle for, I think you start out at $4 a script, and towards the end it was $7.50 a script. So why sell it for $10? The rights to everything. And he did it because he was really a big-hearted man. He was supporting not only his small family, but also about a dozen other members of his extended family who had lost everything during the Great Depression. So this is all taking place in 1933, the darkest days.
Hmm.
FDR just took over the presidency. New Deal was just starting to come into play. People were really struggling, and he was offered a job with job security, a good salary, making more money than he ever had. because Trendle wasn't stupid either. He knew about Stryker's family situation. For $10, you can have all that and take care of your family. And Stryker never felt good about the deal, but he had responsibilities at home. So he signed the rights away to the Lone Ranger. So now you have to think about, you already mentioned the TV series. We were talking radio at this point in the early 30s, but there was TV, there was movies, there was books, there was comic books, there was comic strips in the newspaper, there were toys. All that income Fran missed out on, and it went to Trendle. And then when Trendle sold the rights in 1954, he sold it for $3 million. So this is a pretty good return on a $10 investment. And at the time, it was the biggest deal in entertainment history. And Stryker got like a bonus. He got like 10 grand or something, just a chump change.
Right.
But Stryker was a very gracious man, and he handled that. Forgot the one thing, the key thing, why I didn't know, and why people I don't think know his name like they may know a Stan Lee from the comic book world.
Right.
In the 40s, Trendle still had the rights, and he also started claiming in interviews and in articles that it was he, not Stryker, who created the Lone Ranger. And he kept repeating that lie. And there was even a story floating around that Stryker was brought in to write after the Lone Ranger had already premiered. And Stryker based the Lone Ranger on a script that he wrote 2 years earlier called Covered Wagon Days, episode number 10, and reworked it for Trendle. So that's why Stryker's name is not well known. That lie kept being repeated until Trendle's death in the early 70s. Stryker, unfortunately, was killed in the early 60s in a car crash, and he never wrote his autobiography or his memoirs to tell his side of the story. And in public, he handled everything with grace. He would, when people in private would ask him, what do you think about Trendle claiming he wrote The Ranger? And he would say, the people in the radio industry, everybody knows me. Everyone knows that I wrote it, and they did. And in public, if he was ever asked, he would say something like, only God creates. And he would just kind of deflect the answer. So maybe he wasn't a risk taker, a financial risk taker, but he certainly acted for the best reasons, taking that deal. And he handled it with grace and never confronted Trendle in public or in private. He worked for him up until he sold the rights to the Ranger in 54. And he would always say, hey, no one held a gun to my head. It was a legal document. I made a decision. I was a grown man. And he never whined or cried or became bitter or stopped writing. He was prolific to the end.
Oh, understand. I know the Green Hornet. I'm familiar with that as well, which I didn't know he wrote it. So
the Green Hornet is actually the great nephew of the Lone Ranger.
Right.
So Stryker just carried that family tree of fighting crime right through to the 60s.
Oh, understandable. So your book is a fiction book as well. Now, yep. There's a lot of information out there, I'm sure, about what happened with Stryker and all the events around him. So what is truth and what is fiction in Yesteryear?
Well, it's part magical realism, so all the magic stuff is true. That's what I tell people. So when you hear disembodied radio signals and ghostly voices in the radio, absolutely that all happened. But I approached the same way I did with Rook. I condensed the timeline a little bit. The premiere of The Lone Ranger was actually in Buffalo on WEBR as a pilot, as a test run, before it moved to Detroit and WXYZ. So I combined the timeline to happen everything over just a couple month stretch, when in reality, Stryker signed away the rights about a year later in 34. But the basics are the truth. That's the foundation. How Stryker came up with the idea, using Covered Wagon Days episode 10 as the starting point for the Lone Ranger, having a premiere in Buffalo, his financial situation, the contract. That is all true. One of the ideas that I explore in Yesteryear was the idea of where do stories come from? Because everyone always asks. Non-creative people, we're all creative. Non-writers always ask writers, where'd you get the idea for the story, right? And so part of what I explore in Yesteryear is where do they come from? And the answer is they come from everywhere. So something you say to me in this article, in this interview today, a year from now, I may remember and say, oh, that's a great line that he said. I'm stealing that. And that goes in the book. Something I read in high school. I said, what? What was that? I go to the shelf and pull it off. And, oh, yeah, that's exactly what it was. They happen from everywhere.
Right.
And I explore that in the book. So a lot of what happens, it seems coincidental when you're reading it. But then because you know the Lone Ranger story, you know, even if you're not familiar with the radio show or the TV series, you know Hi-Yo Silver, right? Everyone knows that.
Yep.
And I have a character who every time he greets Stryker, he goes, "Hi-Yo, Stryker." It's just one of those things. I don't make a big deal out of it in the book, but you know as a reader, oh, that's where he got the idea.
Right.
There's a graveyard in Forest Lawn Cemetery, which is in. There's a story called The Wolf Boy of Forest Lawn in Muscle Cars. I revisit that cemetery. It's a Buffalo cemetery where the most famous people are buried. You know, everyone from Rick James to famous people. And there is a monument there of Chief Red Jacket when you first walk in, the Seneca chief. And in front of his monument, there are headstones of other Seneca Native Americans, and there's Jishkaba, and there's 3 or 4 other ones. I put Kimosabi right there, and I don't make a big deal of it, but you go, oh, Kimosabi. That's where Stryker got the idea. So I'm taking the idea of where do we come up with these creative elements that work our way into our stories and our novels, and I'm trying to show where Stryker may have gotten these ideas from, including the story of Bass Reeves, who was a real life person, historical figure, former slave who escaped slavery, and as according to legend, stole a Confederate horse, rode out to the Oklahoma Territory, and became a U.S. Marshal after the Emancipation. And he rode a big white horse. He was a dark figure on a white horse. He would throw silver dollars instead of silver bullets. And he fought for the little guy and was called the Indomitable Marshal. He was nothing but good and pure and fought for the law. And people have said that he may have been the influence of the Lone Ranger character. And he's in the book. So there's a lot of drawing on his history, a lot of drawing on my own imagination. And again, there's some magical realism thrown in there. That's a lot of fun.
All right. Now, that book, Yesteryear, that's coming out in October 3rd of 2023.
Yes.
So what else do you have planned for the future? Because usually once you start, by the time you get to your 3rd book, at a certain point, you're just like, I'm going to keep writing. I imagine you have more that you're planning on going. Do you have any future projections?
Yeah, I'm going to keep going. It took me over 30 years to get here. I can't stop now unless I'm getting published. What's coming out in early 2025 is a book called After Pearl, and I call that my pandemic novel. Although it has absolutely nothing to do with the pandemic, except I started writing it right before the lockdown and finished it almost 2 years later. A lot of my friends, creative friends, writers, visual artists, they had a hard time producing work during the pandemic just because it was such an awful time. The news was so awful and scary that they just couldn't produce.
Right.
I was the opposite. we read to escape. I wrote to escape. I turned the news off and put the blinders on and just created a world where I was in control. So my story, again, is set in Buffalo. It's set in the early 1940s. It's called After Pearl because one of the reasons is it happens after Pearl Harbor.
All
And
right.
it is about an alcoholic detective named Nicholas Bishop. And he is the hotel detective at the Hotel Lafayette, which is one of my favorite hotels and buildings and bars in Buffalo. And he wakes up on the floor of his hotel room after a 5-day bender with no recollection of what's taken place over that 5 days, except there's 2 bullets missing from his fired gun, and the police are questioning him about a missing woman. And so the book tries to piece together the last 5 days of his life that he has no recollection of. That is purely a work of fiction. It's not based on a real life person like Franz Stryker in Yesteryear or Al Nussbaum in Rook. It's purely a creation of my imagination, but it's historical in the sense that I'm drawing on places and what the early days of the war were like. Yeah, really enjoyed that one too. So hopefully that will become a series. At least I think I have 2 more Nicholas Bishop novels in me, and hopefully I can get back to that series soon.
All right. Well, that sounds good. So, sounds like you have a lot going there and you have more coming, which is fantastic to hear. So, with that being said, I don't want to take up all your day. I want to give you time to get coffee since this is early in the morning. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you go, let you have a good day. But I like people to know that they can also find your information on authorblurb.com, where I have a profile of you, and they can reach out to there for you. Your website and the profile link is in the show notes. Where do you prefer people to go find you if they want to find your books, ask you questions, reach out to you? What would you suggest they do?
Yeah, and thank you for doing all that. I appreciate you having me on today. The best way to get a hold of me is going to my website, which is www.sgeoannou.com. That's where you can order the books. If you pre-order through that link through Talking Leaves, you'll get a signed copy of Yesteryear when that comes out. There's a tab that has all my events, my appearances locally, via the internet, interviews, etc. All that's there, as well as just the latest news if you want to keep up with me.
All
So
right.
I would point them in that direction.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate you being on here too. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I'm going to have you hold on for just a moment. This is going to be the end of the conversation for everybody else, but you and I are going to talk a little bit more.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you. You can go to authorblurb.com, where there's plenty of stuff there for you to find. Enjoy another author. Enjoy finding that book that you love. So take the time, do me a favor, share, subscribe, enjoy the show, and tell others. Thank you.